Some mornings, Luke Brennan wondered if he was failing his daughter in ways he couldn't even see. 2 years after losing his wife Sarah, he was still figuring out how to be both mother and father to 7-year-old Ellie, working double shifts just to keep their small house from slipping away. Their backyard garden had become their quiet refuge. While planting tomatoes one Tuesday morning, Luke's shovel hit something hard in the dirt. What he dug up changed everything, a diamond bigger than his fist, sparkling like nothing he'd ever seen. Word spread fast through their struggling neighborhood. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of what Luke had found. But strange things started happening. People acted different around the diamond. Ellie began having dreams about her mother, saying Mama was trying to tell them something important. When lawyers and reporters showed up at their door, Luke realized this blessing might actually be a curse. What happens when a desperate father must choose between saving his family's future and listening to his little girl's impossible dreams? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The small ranch house on Maple Street had seen better days, much like the rest of the neighborhood. Luke Brennan stood at his kitchen window, watching Ellie chase their neighbor's cat around the patchy front lawn, her laughter cutting through the morning quiet like sunlight through storm clouds. At 7, she had her mother's laugh, bright, infectious, and capable of making him forget, for just a moment, how heavy the world had become. Sarah's wedding ring still sat on the windowsill above the sink, catching the early light the same way it had for the past 2 years. Luke couldn't bring himself to move it, though he'd stopped wearing his own months ago. The thin gold band had grown loose on his finger as the weight fell off him during those first terrible months after the funeral. Everything had felt loose, then his clothes, his grip on daily routines, his ability to comfort his daughter when she woke up crying for Mama in the middle of the night. "Daddy, can we plant the sunflowers today?" Ellie's voice drifted through the screen door, followed by the sound of her sneakers slapping against the porch steps. "After breakfast, sweetheart," Luke called back, though his attention remained fixed on the ring. Sarah had chosen it herself, simple, unpretentious, exactly like everything else about their life together. They'd bought the house with a VA loan when Ellie was 2, drawn by the large backyard and the sense of possibility that came with owning something, however modest. Sarah had immediately started planning the garden, sketching layouts on napkins, and talking about teaching Ellie where food really came from. The cancer had taken those plans, along with everything else. Luke turned away from the window and focused on the familiar morning routine: coffee for him, orange juice for Ellie, scrambled eggs that she'd eat half of before declaring herself full. The kitchen table bore the scars of their life together: crayon marks from Ellie's art projects, water rings from countless cups of coffee, a small burn mark from the time Sarah had set down a hot pan without thinking. Each imperfection told a story, and Luke had memorized them all. Ellie bounced through the door, her dark curls so much like Sarah's catching bits of grass and morning dew. "Mrs. Chen says her tomatoes are already getting flowers. Ours are still just green." "That's because she started earlier than we did," Luke explained, setting her plate down. "Good things take time, remember?" It was something Sarah used to say, one of her gentle philosophies that Luke had tried to adopt as his own. Good things take time. Be patient with yourself. There's always tomorrow. In those first months after the diagnosis, when treatments and hospital visits consumed their days, Sarah had clung to these small wisdoms like anchors. Luke had thought they were naive then, desperate attempts to find meaning in the meaningless. Now he understood they were gifts she'd been trying to leave behind. The neighborhood had changed since Sarah's death, though Luke couldn't decide if the changes were real or just his perception shifting. The Hendersons across the street had lost their house to foreclosure last winter, their teenage son Kyle loading boxes into a borrowed pickup truck while his parents stood on the porch looking stunned. The Morales family next door had painted over the bright yellow of their front door with a more subdued beige. Even the corner market where Luke bought milk and bread had changed hands twice, each new owner seeming less invested in the community than the last. But some things endured. Mrs. Chen still tended her prize-winning garden with the dedication of a scientist. Old Pete Morrison still walked his ancient basset hound past their house every morning at exactly 8:15. The mail carrier, Janet, still asked about Ellie and remembered to pet their cat, though they didn't have a cat anymore, another loss in the cascade of changes that followed Sarah's death. Luke's phone buzzed against the counter, displaying a text from his supervisor at the warehouse. "Can you pick up Martinez's shift tonight? Overtime pay." He stared at the message, calculating in his head. The extra money would help with Ellie's school supplies, maybe even leave enough for the new sneakers she needed. But it would mean missing bedtime again, leaving her with Mrs. Chen longer than he liked. "What's wrong, Daddy?" Ellie had stopped eating, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "Nothing, baby. Just work stuff." He forced a smile and tucked the phone away. "Finish your eggs." The morning sun was climbing higher now, painting the kitchen walls with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Luke could see their backyard through the window, 20 feet of grass that needed cutting, bordered by the raised beds he'd built the summer before Sarah died. She'd supervised from a lawn chair, wrapped in blankets, even in the July heat, directing him with gentle corrections and encouragement. "A little deeper, honey. The roots need room to spread." After breakfast, Luke helped Ellie into her garden clothes, old jeans with patches on the knees, and a t-shirt that had once been white, but now bore the permanent stains of a dozen outdoor adventures. She insisted on wearing her mother's old gardening hat, a faded canvas thing that was too big for her head, but made her feel connected to memories she was already struggling to hold on to. They worked together in comfortable silence, Luke preparing the soil, while Ellie carefully placed seeds at measured intervals. She took the job seriously, tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she counted spaces between plantings. Every few minutes, she would ask a question: why did seeds need to be buried? How did they know which way was up? When would they see the first green shoots? And Luke would answer as best he could, drawing on half-remembered conversations with Sarah and whatever he could piece together from gardening websites. "Mama used to sing to the seeds," Ellie announced, sitting back on her heels. "She said it helped them grow faster." Luke's throat tightened. "What did she sing?" "I don't remember all the words. Something about sunshine and rain and being patient." Ellie looked up at him, squinting against the bright morning light. "Do you think she's watching us now?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the conversations Luke had been avoiding. He'd grown up in a family where faith was mentioned on Sundays and forgotten the rest of the week, and Sarah's death had complicated his relationship with hope even further. But looking at his daughter's expectant face, he found himself searching for words that might offer comfort without making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "I think she'd be proud of how hard you're working on the garden," he said finally. "She always said the best way to remember someone is to keep doing the things they loved." Ellie nodded solemnly and returned to her planting. Luke watched her small hands work the soil, marveling at her resilience. Children, he'd learned, had an extraordinary capacity for accepting new realities. Where he saw absence, she often found presence. Where he struggled with questions that had no answers, she created her own understanding and moved forward with it. The morning stretched on, peaceful and productive. They planted sunflowers along the back fence, carrots in neat rows, and a small patch of herbs near the kitchen door. Luke found himself relaxing for the first time in weeks, his muscles loosening as he fell into the rhythm of simple, productive work. There was something healing about putting seeds in the ground, about the act of faith required to believe that something beautiful would grow from such small beginnings. By lunchtime, they had worked their way to the corner of the garden where Luke had planned to expand the tomato bed. The soil here seemed different, richer somehow, darker than the rest of the yard. Luke made a mental note to test it later, wondering if there might be some natural factor that made this spot more fertile. "Can we plant the tomatoes here?" Ellie asked, pointing to the exact spot Luke had been considering. "That's exactly what I was thinking," he said, impressed once again by her intuition. They worked together to clear the area of grass and weeds, Ellie pulling up the smaller plants, while Luke attacked the more established growth with his shovel. The tool was older than their marriage, a sturdy steel blade on a wooden handle that had belonged to Sarah's father. It had planted vegetable gardens in 3 different states, helped build flower beds for 2 houses, and served as the primary implement for every outdoor project Luke had attempted since inheriting it. As he worked, Luke found his mind wandering to the practical concerns that never seemed to leave him alone for long. The mortgage payment was due next week, and even with the extra shifts he'd been picking up, money remained tight. Ellie would need new clothes before school started, and the car had been making a worrying noise that probably meant an expensive repair. Sometimes he felt like he was running on a treadmill, working harder and harder just to stay in the same place. But here in the garden, with his daughter humming tunelessly beside him and the sun warm on his shoulders, those worries felt manageable. This was what Sarah had understood, that some kinds of wealth couldn't be measured in bank statements or credit scores. The sound of Ellie's laughter, the satisfaction of soil under his fingernails, the promise of fresh tomatoes in a few months, these things had value that transcended economic anxiety. Luke drove the shovel deeper into the earth, working to break up a particularly stubborn clump of clay. The blade hit something solid with a metallic ring that seemed to echo longer than it should have. He paused, frowning, and tried again in a slightly different spot. Another ring, this time accompanied by a scraping sound that suggested metal against stone. "What's wrong, Daddy?" "Probably just a rock," Luke said, though something in the sound bothered him. "Let me dig around it a little." He worked carefully, using the shovel's edge to probe the boundaries of whatever lay buried beneath their modest backyard. Whatever it was seemed larger than a typical stone and positioned at an odd depth, too shallow to be a natural geological formation, too deep to be casual debris. As he cleared away more soil, Luke began to make out edges and corners that suggested something geometric, something placed rather than naturally occurring. The sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the garden. Ellie had grown bored with watching him dig and had wandered off to check on their other plantings, chattering to the seeds about how excited she was to see them grow. Luke continued working, his curiosity now fully engaged. In 20 minutes of careful excavation, he had uncovered what appeared to be the corner of some kind of container metal, judging by the sound, and roughly rectangular in shape. A buried treasure chest, he thought with amusement, remembering the pirate stories Ellie loved. More likely an old septic tank component or some previous owner's attempt at a time capsule. The house had been built in the 1960s, and who knew what sorts of projects the original inhabitants had undertaken. Luke glanced at his watch and realized they'd been outside for nearly 3 hours. Ellie was starting to show signs of the restlessness that preceded her afternoon nap, and he had promised to take her to the library later. Whatever lay buried in their garden would have to wait for another day. "Come on, sweetheart," he called. "Time to clean up for lunch." As they gathered their tools and headed toward the house, Luke took one last look at the partially excavated corner. Something about it nagged at him, not worry exactly, but a sense that their quiet Tuesday morning had uncovered something more significant than either of them yet understood. The next morning arrived grey and humid, with the kind of heavy air that promised afternoon thunderstorms. Luke had woken at 5:30, his mind already turning over the mystery buried in their garden. Sleep had come fitfully, interrupted by dreams of Sarah standing in their backyard, pointing toward the corner where he'd been digging. She'd been trying to tell him something, but her words had been lost in the sound of wind through leaves. Ellie was still asleep when Luke slipped outside with his coffee and the old shovel. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the distant hum of early commuters on the highway and the rhythmic sprinkler system that Mrs. Chen had programmed to water her prized vegetables. Luke stood over the partially excavated corner, studying what he could see of the buried object in the grey morning light. 20 minutes of careful digging revealed more of what appeared to be a metal container, roughly the size of a toolbox, but heavier than anything that description suggested. The metal was tarnished but not rusted, suggesting it hadn't been buried for decades. Luke worked methodically, clearing soil from around the edges, until he could make out the full outline of a rectangular box with what looked like a hinged lid. When he finally managed to work the container free from the earth, Luke was surprised by its weight. The box was perhaps 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 8 inches deep, but it felt like it contained something far denser than tools or documents. The metal was a dull silver color, unmarked except for a simple clasp that had somehow remained functional despite its burial. Luke carried the box to his back porch and set it on the weathered wooden table where he and Ellie ate breakfast on pleasant mornings. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the clasp, not from fear, exactly, but from the sense that opening this container would change something fundamental about their quiet life. The lid opened with surprising ease, revealing an interior lined with what looked like black velvet. Nestled in that dark fabric was something that made Luke's breath catch in his throat, and his rational mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. It was a diamond, not a small stone that might have fallen from someone's ring, but a gemstone the size of a child's fist, cut with such precision that even in the grey morning light it seemed to capture and amplify every available photon. The stone was perfectly clear, without the slightest hint of color or imperfection, and as Luke stared at it, he felt a strange sensation, as if the diamond was looking back at him with an intelligence that transcended mere geology. Luke reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering inches above the stone. Something about touching it felt momentous, like crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. But curiosity won over caution, and he gently lifted the diamond from its velvet nest. The weight was surprisingly heavier than he'd expected, but not uncomfortably so. The surface was cool against his palm, with faceted edges that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Luke had never seen anything like it outside of museum displays or movie screens. This wasn't the sort of stone that belonged in suburban backyards or the lives of warehouse workers struggling to pay their mortgages. "Daddy, what are you doing?" Luke spun around to find Ellie standing in the doorway, her hair mussed from sleep and her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. She was staring not at him, but at the diamond in his hand, her dark eyes wide with an expression Luke couldn't quite interpret. "I've found something in the garden, sweetheart." Luke's voice sounded strange to his own ears, as if speaking about the diamond made it more real. "I'm not sure what it is yet." Ellie stepped onto the porch, moving with the cautious curiosity of a cat investigating something new. When she was close enough to see the stone clearly, she stopped and tilted her head to one side, a gesture so reminiscent of Sarah that Luke felt his chest tighten. "It's pretty," she said simply. "But it feels sad." "Sad?" Luke looked down at the diamond, trying to understand what his daughter might be, sensing that he could not. "What do you mean?" "I don't know." Ellie shrugged, still staring at the stone. "It just does, like it misses something." Before Luke could respond, the sound of a lawnmower starting up next door broke the moment's spell. He quickly placed the diamond back in its container and closed the lid, though he noticed that Ellie's gaze remained fixed on the box, as if she could still see through to its contents. "Let's keep this between us for now, okay?" Luke said, lifting the container and wondering where in their small house he could safely hide something that might be incredibly valuable. "Until I figure out what it is." Ellie nodded solemnly, the way she did when Luke asked her to keep secrets about surprise birthday presents or Christmas gifts. But as they headed inside for breakfast, Luke caught her looking back at the table where the box had been, her expression thoughtful in a way that seemed too old for her 7 years. The rest of the morning passed in a strange duality of normalcy and unreality. Luke made pancakes while Ellie watched cartoons, but his mind kept returning to the weight of the diamond in his hand and the strange sense that finding it had set something in motion that he didn't understand. He found himself glancing toward the kitchen cabinet where he'd hidden the box, half convinced that he'd imagined the entire episode. During lunch, Luke's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, which usually meant either a bill collector or someone trying to sell him something he couldn't afford. But when he answered, the voice on the other end was that of Mrs. Chen from next door. "Luke, dear, I hope you don't mind me calling. I saw you digging in your garden quite early, and then Harold mentioned he thought he saw some unusual light coming from your backyard." Luke felt his pulse quicken. Harold was Mrs. Chen's husband, a retired electrician with sharp eyes and too much time on his hands. Unusual light. Oh, you know Harold, he probably imagined it, but he was quite insistent that he saw some kind of bright flash around 7 this morning. I told him it was probably just the sun reflecting off something, but he wanted me to check and make sure you weren't having electrical problems. "No problems," Luke said carefully. "I was just doing some gardening." "Of course, dear. I didn't think it was anything serious, although—" Mrs. Chen paused, and Luke could practically hear her choosing her words. "Harold did mention that he's never seen light quite like that before. Very white," he said. "Very bright." After hanging up, Luke sat staring at his phone, a cold realization creeping over him. If Harold had seen light coming from their backyard, it meant the diamond had somehow been visible from the neighbor's house, and if one neighbor had noticed, others might have as well. That afternoon, Luke's fears were confirmed. He was cleaning up lunch dishes when he spotted Pete Morrison standing at the edge of their front yard, ostensibly walking his ancient basset hound, but clearly studying their house with unusual interest. When Pete saw Luke watching from the window, he waved and approached the front door. "Afternoon, Luke. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Sure is, Pete. How's Buster doing?" Luke nodded toward the old dog, who was sniffing around their mailbox with the dedication of a detective. "Oh, he's fine. Getting slower, but aren't we all?" Pete chuckled, but his eyes kept drifting toward the backyard. "I couldn't help but notice you were doing some excavation work back there. Find anything interesting?" The question was casual, but something in Pete's tone set off alarm bells in Luke's mind. "Just expanding the garden. Nothing exciting." "Ah." Pete nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, if you ever need help with any heavy digging, you know where to find me. These old bones still have some work left in them." As Pete walked away, Luke noticed that Buster seemed reluctant to leave their yard, straining against his leash and whining softly as they headed down the street. Dogs, Luke remembered reading somewhere, were supposed to be sensitive to things humans couldn't perceive. The final confirmation that their secret was already spreading came just before dinner. Luke was helping Ellie with a coloring book when someone knocked on their front door, not the casual rap of a neighbor, but the confident, persistent knock of someone with official business. Through the window, Luke could see a man in an expensive suit holding what appeared to be business cards. He was young, probably early 30s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested corporate employment and disposable income. Behind him, parked in Luke's driveway, was a silver BMW that looked like it had been driven off the lot that morning. Luke opened the door but left the security chain engaged. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Brennan, my name is David Wells, and I represent Meridian Acquisitions. I understand you may have recently discovered something of value on your property, and I'd like to discuss some options that might be of interest to you." The man's smile was professional and practiced, but his eyes held an intensity that made Luke instinctively protective. Behind him, Luke could see 2 more cars parked on the street, a van with tinted windows and what looked like a news station logo on the side. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong house," Luke said, though his heart was racing. "Mr. Brennan, I think we both know that's not true. Wells's smile never wavered, but his voice carried a note of authority that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. Word travels fast in situations like this. I'm here to make sure you understand all your options before making any decisions you might regret. Luke closed the door without another word, but as he turned away from the window, he could see Wells walking back to his car, already speaking into a cell phone. The man's posture suggested that Luke's refusal had been expected, perhaps even planned for. "Daddy?" Ellie appeared beside him, her coloring book forgotten. "Who was that man?" "No one important, sweetheart." But even as Luke said the words, he knew they weren't true. Somehow, in less than 24 hours, their impossible discovery had attracted attention from people who clearly had resources and determination. As darkness fell and Luke tucked Ellie into bed, he found himself checking the locks on their doors and windows with unusual care. The diamond remained hidden in their kitchen cabinet, but its presence seemed to fill the house like a low-frequency hum that he could feel in his bones. Later that night, as Luke lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he tried to make sense of what was happening to their quiet life. Yesterday morning, his biggest worry had been picking up an extra shift to cover Ellie's school supplies. Now, he was hiding what might be the most valuable thing he'd ever touched, while strangers in expensive cars gathered outside his house like wolves circling a campfire. The diamond had indeed changed everything, just as he'd sensed it would. But as Luke finally drifted towards sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real changes were only beginning. Luke woke before dawn to the sound of voices in his front yard. Through the bedroom window, he could see the dark outlines of several vehicles parked along Maple Street, their occupants moving about with the purposeful energy of people who had somewhere important to be. The digital clock on his nightstand read 5:47 a.m., but the activity outside suggested the day had started hours ago for some people. He slipped out of bed and crept to the living room window, careful not to turn on any lights that might announce his presence. What he saw made his stomach drop. There were at least 6 cars now, ranging from the silver BMW he'd seen yesterday to a van with satellite equipment mounted on its roof. Men and women in business attire stood in small groups, some holding coffee cups, others speaking quietly into cell phones. It looked like a staging area for some kind of operation. Luke's phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the night, calls from numbers he didn't recognize that went straight to voicemail. Now, as he checked the screen, he saw 17 missed calls and a text message inbox full of notifications. The first voicemail was from someone claiming to represent a gemstone authentication service. The second was from a reporter asking for an interview. The third began with the words, "federal tax implications," and Luke deleted it without listening to the rest. "Daddy?" Ellie's voice was small and uncertain. "Why are there cars outside?" Luke turned to find his daughter standing in the hallway, her hair mussed from sleep and her favorite blanket trailing behind her. She was looking toward the window with the same wary expression she'd worn during the thunderstorms that had frightened her as a toddler. "Some people heard about something we found," Luke said carefully. "They're curious about it." "The pretty stone." Luke nodded, struck again by his daughter's intuitive understanding of situations that should have been beyond her comprehension. "But it's our stone, right? We found it in our garden." The question carried more weight than Ellie probably intended, touching on legal and ethical issues that Luke hadn't even begun to consider. Who owned something valuable, found buried in a backyard? The current property owner? The previous owner who might have buried it? The original owner, whoever that might be? Luke realized he needed answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. While Ellie ate breakfast, Luke called in sick to work the first time he'd missed a shift in over a year. His supervisor, Marcus, was understanding but clearly frustrated. "You sure you're okay, Brennan? You've been picking up extra shifts for months, and now you need time off with no notice?" "Family emergency," Luke said, which wasn't entirely untrue. "Well, handle whatever you need to handle. But we've got the Henderson contract deadline next week, and I was counting on you." After hanging up, Luke realized he'd added another problem to his growing list. Missing work meant missing pay, and despite whatever value the diamond might have, his bills were still due at the end of the month. Luke spent the morning researching gemstone appraisal services online, while Ellie played quietly in her room. What he learned was both encouraging and terrifying. If the stone was genuine, and he was becoming increasingly convinced it was, its value could be measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more. But legitimate appraisal required documentation, provenance research, and dealing with authorities who would ask questions Luke wasn't sure he could answer. At 10:30, someone knocked on their back door. Luke peered through the kitchen curtains to see a woman in her 50s holding what appeared to be a jewelry loop, the kind of magnifying device he'd seen in movies about diamond merchants. She was alone, which made her seem less threatening than the crowd gathering in front of his house, but her presence meant people were now approaching from multiple directions. "Mr. Brennan," she called through the door. "My name is Eleanor Vasquez. I'm a certified gemologist, and I'd like to help you understand what you've found." Luke opened the door but remained standing in the threshold. "I'm not sure what you mean." Eleanor smiled, but her expression was serious. "Mr. Brennan, word has gotten out about your discovery. Right now, you have people outside your house who are not necessarily acting in your best interests. I'm here to offer you professional guidance before you make any decisions you might regret." There was something about her directness that Luke found refreshing after the corporate smoothness of yesterday's visitor. "What kind of guidance?" "The kind that could save you from making a very expensive mistake." Eleanor held up the loop. "May I see the stone?" Luke hesitated, but the woman's credentials seemed legitimate, and he desperately needed expert advice. He retrieved the box from its hiding place and set it on the kitchen table. When Eleanor opened the container and saw the diamond, her professional composure cracked for just a moment. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, then caught herself. "I'm sorry. It's just that in 30 years of appraising gemstones, I've never seen anything quite like this." She spent 20 minutes examining the diamond from every angle, occasionally making soft sounds of amazement or concern. Luke watched her work, noting the way her hands trembled slightly as she held the stone up to the light. "Mr. Brennan," Eleanor said finally, "this is a natural diamond of exceptional quality and size. Based on my preliminary examination, I would estimate its value at somewhere between $4 and $6 million. The number hit Luke like a physical blow. He sat down heavily in his kitchen chair, trying to process what she'd just told him. $6 million. Enough money to pay off the house, put Ellie through college, set up a trust fund that would secure their future for generations. Enough money to solve every financial problem they'd ever had, with plenty left over for problems they hadn't imagined yet. However, Eleanor continued, there are significant complications. A stone of this size and quality doesn't just appear in suburban gardens. This diamond should have a documented history, certificates of authenticity, records of previous ownership, insurance documentation. The fact that it doesn't raises serious questions. What kind of questions? Legal ones. A diamond like this could be stolen property. It could have been buried to avoid taxes or to hide assets during a divorce. It could be part of an estate that was never properly settled. Until you can establish clear provenance, you can't legally sell it, and any attempt to do so could result in criminal charges. Luke felt the brief surge of hope that had accompanied Eleanor's valuation drain away, replaced by a familiar sense of life's complications always outweighing its gifts. "So it's worthless to me." "Not worthless," Eleanor said carefully, "but potentially dangerous. The people outside your house right now, some of them represent legitimate businesses, but others might be less scrupulous. A $6 million diamond attracts attention from people who don't always operate within legal boundaries." As if summoned by her words, Luke's doorbell rang. Then it rang again, and again. Someone was leaning on the button with the persistence of a bill collector who knew you were home. "Don't answer it," Eleanor advised. "In fact, I'd recommend you and your daughter find somewhere else to stay for a few days while you figure out your next steps." Through the front window, Luke could see the crowd outside had grown larger. There were now at least a dozen people gathered on his lawn, some holding cameras, others engaged in animated conversations on their phones. His quiet neighborhood was beginning to look like the scene of a minor celebrity scandal. "Mr. Brennan," Eleanor said softly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Did you actually find this diamond in your garden, or did someone give it to you?" The question caught Luke off guard. "I found it yesterday morning. Why would you ask that?" "Because this stone is perfect, not just high-quality perfect. Diamonds like this are incredibly rare, and they don't get buried in random backyards by accident. Someone put it there deliberately, which means someone knows it exists and knows where it was hidden." A chill ran down Luke's spine as the implications of Eleanor's words sank in. If someone had buried the diamond intentionally, they might come looking for it, and they might not be pleased to discover that a complete stranger had dug it up. "What should I do?" Luke asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "First, get your daughter out of here. Take her somewhere safe while you decide how to handle this. Second, contact a lawyer who specializes in property law. You're going to need legal advice before you take any other steps. Third, don't trust anyone who approaches you with quick solutions or easy money. This situation is complicated, and simple answers are probably wrong answers." Eleanor packed up her equipment and handed Luke a business card. "Call me if you need help navigating the appraisal process, but be very careful who else you trust. A diamond like this can make people do things they wouldn't normally consider." After she left, Luke stood in his kitchen, staring at the box that contained their impossible discovery. $6 million. The number kept echoing in his mind, accompanied by Eleanor's warnings about the dangers that came with such wealth. He thought about Sarah, wondering what she would have done in this situation. She'd always been the practical one, the planner who thought 3 steps ahead, while Luke focused on the immediate problem in front of him. "Daddy?" Ellie appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding her stuffed rabbit and looking concerned. "Are we in trouble?" Luke knelt down and pulled his daughter into a hug, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and the lingering smell of sleep on her pajamas. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble, but we might need to go visit someone for a few days while I figure some things out. Because of the pretty stone." "Because of the pretty stone," Luke confirmed. As he held his daughter, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had just become infinitely more complicated. The diamond that had seemed like a miracle yesterday now felt like a burden that might be too heavy for him to carry safely. But as Ellie pulled back and looked at him with her mother's trusting eyes, Luke knew he had to find a way to protect both his daughter and their unexpected discovery, no matter how difficult that path might prove to be. That evening, Luke sat cross-legged on Ellie's bedroom floor, while she carefully drew pictures in a small spiral notebook he'd bought her at the drugstore. He'd told her it was for keeping track of her dreams, the way some people kept diaries, and she'd embraced the idea with the seriousness she brought to most new projects. "Mama came to see me again last night," Ellie said without looking up from her drawing. Her crayon moved in careful circles as she colored what appeared to be a woman's hair. She was wearing her blue dress, the one from the picture on your dresser. Luke felt his chest tighten. The blue dress had been Sarah's favorite, the one she'd worn to their anniversary dinner 6 months before the diagnosis. Ellie had been 4 when Sarah died, and Luke sometimes wondered how much she actually remembered versus how much she'd constructed from photographs and stories. "What did she say?" Luke asked gently. "She said the pretty stone isn't really ours." Ellie switched to a brown crayon for the woman's eyes. "She said it belongs to someone who's been waiting a long time to get it back." Luke studied his daughter's profile, searching for signs that she might be repeating something she'd overheard from Eleanor's visit that morning. But Ellie's expression held the matter-of-fact certainty of a child reporting the weather or announcing what she wanted for breakfast. "Did she say anything else?" She said you're worried about money again, but the stone won't fix that kind of worried. Ellie looked up from her notebook, her dark eyes serious. She said some things can't be bought, even with all the money in the world. The accuracy of Ellie's observation struck Luke like a physical blow. He'd been trying to hide his financial stress, but children had a way of perceiving emotional undercurrents that adults thought they'd successfully concealed. And Sarah had indeed said something almost identical during her final months, when the medical bills were mounting and Luke was working every available shift to stay ahead of their growing debt. Luke's phone buzzed with another call from an unknown number. He'd stopped answering them hours ago, but the constant interruptions were wearing on his nerves. The voicemail notifications showed 37 unheard messages, and his email inbox was flooded with inquiries from reporters, lawyers, gemstone dealers, and people claiming to represent various government agencies. "Daddy, are you scared?" Ellie asked, her crayon poised over the notebook. The question was direct in the way only children's questions could be, cutting through all the adult complications to the emotional core of the situation. Luke considered lying, offering reassurance that he didn't feel, but something in his daughter's expression suggested she would see through any attempt at false confidence. "A little scared," he admitted, "but not of anything that would hurt us, more like scared of making the wrong decision about something important." Ellie nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Mama said you'll know what to do when it's time to know. She said you're braver than you think." Luke blinked back unexpected tears. Whether Ellie was repeating actual dream conversations or channeling her own intuitive wisdom through memories of her mother, her words carried a comfort that he desperately needed. The next morning brought more crowds, more phone calls, and the arrival of someone Luke definitely hadn't expected. His brother Danny, standing on the front porch with an expression of barely contained excitement and a copy of the local newspaper tucked under his arm. "Jesus Christ, Luke," Danny said as soon as the front door opened. "Why didn't you call me?" Luke let his brother inside, noting the way Danny's eyes immediately started scanning the room, as if he expected to see the diamond sitting on the coffee table. Danny was 3 years older than Luke, a real estate agent who specialized in high-end properties and had never quite forgiven his younger brother for choosing warehouse work over what Danny considered more ambitious career options. "Call you about what?" Luke asked, though he suspected he knew where this conversation was heading. Danny spread the newspaper on the kitchen table, revealing a front-page story with the headline, "Local Man Discovers Massive Diamond in Backyard Garden." The article was accompanied by a photograph of their house taken from the street and a sidebar estimating the stone's value at several $1,000,000. "About this," Danny said, stabbing the headline with his finger. "About the fact that you're sitting on the biggest windfall in family history and handling it like some kind of amateur." Luke scanned the article, his heart sinking as he read details that he hadn't shared with anyone. The reporter had somehow learned Eleanor's estimated value range and had quoted sources close to the situation who claimed the diamond was of museum quality. Either someone had been talking who shouldn't have been, or the story was being driven by speculation that was rapidly becoming accepted as fact. "Danny, it's not that simple." "Not that simple?" Danny's voice rose in the way it always did when he thought Luke was being unreasonably cautious. "Luke, this is a multi-million-dollar gemstone. Do you have any idea what this could mean for your future, for Ellie's future?" "I'm starting to," Luke said quietly. "Then why are you hiding in your house instead of talking to the people who want to help you capitalize on this opportunity?" Danny gestured toward the front window, where the crowd of interested parties had grown to include what appeared to be a food truck and several people setting up folding chairs. "You've got buyers lined up outside your door, and you're treating them like door-to-door salesmen." Luke poured himself a cup of coffee, buying time to organize his thoughts. Danny meant well, but his brother's approach to life had always been to identify the financial opportunity in any situation and pursue it aggressively. The complexity of their current situation, the legal questions, the provenance issues, the safety concerns, would strike Danny as obstacles to overcome rather than genuine reasons for caution. "Where's Ellie?" Danny asked, apparently noticing for the first time that his niece wasn't visible. "Playing in her room." Luke lowered his voice. "Danny, there are problems with this whole situation that you don't understand. The diamond might not legally belong to us. There could be criminal implications if we try to sell it without proper documentation." "Criminal implications?" Danny laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Luke, you found it on your own property. Possession is 9/10 of the law. The worst that could happen is you'd have to share it with someone else who claims ownership, and even half of several $1 million is more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes of warehouse work." Luke started to explain Eleanor's warnings about stolen property and documentation requirements, but Danny cut him off with an impatient wave. "Look, I've already made some calls. I know people who know people in the gemstone business. There are ways to handle situations like this that don't involve getting bogged down in legal paperwork that could take years to resolve. You could have a check in your hand by the end of the week." The offer was tempting in ways that Luke found disturbing. A check by the end of the week would solve their immediate financial problems and provide security for Ellie's future that he'd never imagined possible. But Eleanor's warnings about people who didn't operate within legal boundaries echoed in his mind, and he found himself wondering if his brother's contacts fell into that category. "I need to think about this," Luke said. "Think about what?" Danny's frustration was becoming more apparent. "Luke, opportunities like this don't come along twice. The longer you wait, the more complicated this is going to get. Pretty soon you'll have lawyers and government agencies involved, and then everything gets tied up in bureaucracy that could last for years. Maybe that's what needs to happen." Danny stared at his brother, as if Luke had just announced his intention to give away their family inheritance. "Are you serious? You're going to let bureaucrats and lawyers tie up millions of dollars because you're afraid of a little complexity?" The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the front door, not the insistent buzzing of yesterday's visitors, but a polite, measured sound that suggested official business. Through the window, Luke could see a man in his 60s wearing a suit that looked government-issued and carrying a briefcase that reinforced the impression of official authority. Luke opened the door to find a badge being displayed, along with a business card. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Agent Harrison, with the FBI's art crime team. I'd like to speak with you about your recent discovery." Danny appeared behind Luke, his expression shifting from frustration to concern. "FBI? What's this about?" Agent Harrison's smile was professional but not unfriendly. "Nothing that should alarm you, Mr. Brennan. We've heard about your discovery, and we'd like to help you navigate the legal aspects of your situation. May I come in?" Luke stepped aside, and Agent Harrison entered their small living room with the careful attention of someone trained to notice details. He accepted Luke's offer of coffee and settled into their worn armchair with the patient demeanor of someone prepared for a long conversation. "First, let me assure you that you're not in any legal trouble," Harrison began. "Finding valuable property on your own land doesn't constitute a crime. However, we do have some concerns about the specific item you've discovered." "What kind of concerns?" Danny asked, his real estate agent instincts apparently kicking in. Harrison opened his briefcase and withdrew a file folder. "Over the past decade, several high-value diamonds have been reported stolen from private collections, insurance company vaults, and museum exhibits. Based on the descriptions we've seen in the media, your discovery matches the characteristics of at least 3 stones that remain on our active investigation list." Luke felt his stomach drop. "You think the diamond is stolen?" "We think it's possible," Harrison said carefully, "which is why we'd like to examine it and compare it to our database of missing gems. If it matches one of our open cases, we can help you work with the rightful owners to resolve the situation legally. If it doesn't match, you'll have documentation that supports your legitimate ownership." Danny leaned forward in his chair. "And if it does match one of your cases, Then the stone would be returned to its rightful owner, and Mr. Brennan would receive any applicable reward for its recovery. Harrison's tone remained neutral, but Luke caught the implication that such a reward would be substantially less than the diamond's full value. As Agent Harrison explained the process for authenticating and investigating high-value discoveries, Luke found himself thinking about Ellie's dreams and her conviction that the stone belonged to someone who had been waiting to get it back. Maybe his 7-year-old daughter understood something about their situation that the adults had missed. The conversation continued for another hour, covering legal procedures, documentation requirements, and the timeline for resolving ownership questions. By the time Agent Harrison left, Luke felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what had seemed like a simple discovery just 2 days earlier. Danny waited until the FBI agent was gone before voicing his frustration. "Luke, you realize that guy just talked you into voluntarily giving up millions of dollars, right? There's no law that says you have to cooperate with their investigation. There's no law that says I have to avoid cooperating either," Luke replied. "Danny, what if the stone really is stolen? What if someone lost it or had it taken from them, and they've been searching for it for years? Then that's their problem, not yours. You didn't steal it. You found it on your own property." Luke looked toward Ellie's room, where he could hear her humming softly to herself as she played. His daughter's dreams suggested that keeping the diamond would be wrong, even if it was legal. And increasingly, Luke found himself trusting Ellie's instincts more than the adult voices, urging him toward financial opportunity. The question was whether he was brave enough to follow a 7-year-old's spiritual guidance when it led away from the security that money could provide. The old property deed was yellowed with age and smelled faintly of the cardboard box where Luke had found it buried among the previous owner's documents in the basement. He'd been searching for any information about the house's history that might explain how a multi-million-dollar diamond had ended up buried in their backyard, and the deed had been tucked between insurance policies and tax records that the estate sale company had apparently overlooked. The document told a story that Luke hadn't expected. Their modest house had originally belonged to a man named Samuel Reeves, who had purchased the property in 1962 as a young man returning from military service overseas. According to the deed, Reeves had paid cash for the house, unusual for a veteran in his 20s, and had lived there alone for over 40 years until his death in 2004. Luke spread the paperwork across his kitchen table, creating a timeline of ownership that revealed gaps in the official record. Samuel Reeves had never married, had no listed heirs, and had apparently died intestate. The house had eventually been sold by the county to cover unpaid taxes, passing through 2 brief ownerships before Luke and Sarah had bought it through their VA loan. But it was a letter tucked behind the deed that made Luke's hands tremble as he read. Written in Samuel Reeves's careful handwriting and dated just 3 months before his death. It was addressed to "whoever finds this" and contained information that changed everything Luke thought he knew about their discovery. "I'm writing this because I can't take the secret with me to the grave," the letter began. "The diamond buried in the back corner of my garden doesn't belong to me, and it never did. I took it from a family in France during the war, and I've spent 60 years trying to figure out how to make that right." Luke read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. Samuel Reeves had been a soldier during World War II, stationed in occupied France. According to his confession, he had been billeted with a French family, the Dubois, who had hidden their valuables from Nazi looters by burying them in their garden. When Reeves's unit was transferred suddenly, he had taken the diamond, telling himself he would find a way to return it after the war ended. "I tried to find them," the letter continued. "Spent years writing letters, hiring investigators, following leads that went nowhere. The house where I stayed was destroyed in the fighting. The family disappeared, killed, moved, scattered by the war. I never found so much as a grave marker or a forwarding address. So I kept their diamond, and it kept my guilt." The letter explained why Reeves had buried the stone in his garden rather than selling it or turning it over to authorities. It didn't belong to me to sell, he had written, and I couldn't trust the government to find the right family when I couldn't do it myself. So I put it back in a garden, where it belonged, and hoped that someday someone smarter or luckier than me would figure out how to make things right. Luke set the letter down and stared out his kitchen window at the small patch of earth where he'd made his discovery. Samuel Reeves had died carrying the weight of a 60-year-old theft, unable to find redemption, but unwilling to profit from his crime. The diamond that had seemed like a miracle 2 days ago was actually evidence of an old man's decades-long struggle with guilt and responsibility. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Agent Harrison's number, and Luke answered with a sense of resignation rather than surprise. "Mr. Brennan, I have some information that I think you'll want to hear," Harrison said without preamble. "We've been comparing your diamond to our database, and we may have found a match." Luke wasn't surprised. "Tell me." "There's a case from 1943 involving a French family named Dubois, who reported the theft of family heirlooms by an American soldier. The report was filed through the French resistance and eventually made its way to our predecessor agencies. The description of the stolen diamond matches your discovery almost exactly. What happened to the family? That's where it gets complicated. The father, Henri Dubois, was killed in a bombing raid 6 months after the theft was reported. The mother, Marie, and their daughter, Isabelle, survived the war but emigrated to Canada in 1946. We've been able to trace their movements to Montreal, where Marie died in 1967. But Isabelle, she would be in her 80s, now appears to still be alive. Luke felt his heart racing. After 60 years, Samuel Reeves's guilt-ridden secret might finally lead to resolution. "Have you contacted her?" "We've located what we believe is the correct address, but we wanted to speak with you first." "Mr. Brennan, if this diamond belongs to Isabelle Dubois, are you prepared to return it to her?" The question hung in the air, weighted with implications that went far beyond legal requirements. Luke thought about his financial struggles, about Ellie's future, about the security that millions of dollars could provide. Then he thought about an old soldier who had carried guilt for 60 years because he couldn't find a way to make things right. "Yes," Luke said, and as the word left his mouth, he felt something that might have been relief. "If it's hers, she should have it back." "I was hoping you'd say that. There's something else you should know. Mrs. Dubois has been searching for that diamond for decades. She hired investigators, placed ads in newspapers, even contacted veterans organizations trying to find the American soldier who took it. It's the last piece of her father's legacy, and she's never stopped believing she'd get it back someday." After hanging up, Luke sat in his kitchen, staring at Samuel Reeves's letter. The old soldier had been right about one thing: Luke was luckier than Reeves had been. Technology, government databases, and international cooperation had made it possible to accomplish in days what Reeves couldn't achieve in decades of searching. That afternoon brought a development that Luke hadn't anticipated. His supervisor Marcus called, his voice carrying a tone that suggested official business rather than personal concern. "Luke, I need you to come in tomorrow morning. We need to talk about your employment status." Luke felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "I mean that having reporters calling the warehouse asking about our employees is creating problems for the company, and frankly, the attention you're getting is making some people uncomfortable. Management thinks it might be better for everyone if you took some extended time off." Extended time off was corporate speak for being fired, Luke realized. The diamond that had promised to solve his financial problems was actually costing him the job that kept food on their table and a roof over their heads. "Marcus, I need this job. Whatever's happening with the diamond situation, it doesn't affect my work performance." "I know that, Luke, but it's not about performance. It's about the disruption. We've got contracts to fulfill, and having news vans in our parking lot isn't helping anyone focus on getting the work done." After hanging up, Luke realized that his life was being taken apart, piece by forces beyond his control. The diamond had attracted attention that was costing him his job, filling his neighborhood with strangers, and putting pressure on his family that he'd never anticipated. Even if he decided to keep the stone and find a way to sell it legally, the damage to their quiet life might already be irreversible. That evening, as Luke helped Ellie with her bath, she asked a question that cut straight to the heart of his dilemma. "Daddy, if keeping the pretty stone makes everyone upset, why don't we just give it back to the person it belongs to?" Luke paused in the middle of shampooing her hair. "What makes you think it belongs to someone else?" "Mama told me. She said there's a lady who's been crying about it for a really long time, and that lady should get to stop crying now." Luke finished rinsing Ellie's hair in silence, struck by his daughter's matter-of-fact acceptance of what the adults around them were treating as a complex moral and legal puzzle. To Ellie, the solution was simple. If something belonged to someone else, you gave it back. The financial implications, the lost opportunities, the complicated legal procedures, none of that mattered as much as doing what was right. Later that night, Luke called Agent Harrison back. "I want to contact Mrs. Dubois," he said. "I want to arrange to return her diamond." "Are you certain about this decision, Mr. Brennan? Once we make contact, there's no going back. And I should mention that there's no legal requirement for you to return the diamond. Your claim as the finder is actually quite strong." Luke looked toward Ellie's room, where his daughter was sleeping peacefully for the first time since they'd found the diamond. "I'm certain some things are more important than legal rights." "I'll make the arrangements," Harrison said. "But Mr. Brennan, you should know what you're doing is going to restore more than just a family heirloom. Dubois has been searching for this diamond because it's the only thing she has left of her father. You're giving her back a piece of her history that she thought was lost forever." As Luke hung up the phone, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The decision to return the diamond felt right in a way that keeping it never had, despite the financial security that selling it might have provided. For the first time since finding the stone, Luke slept deeply, undisturbed by dreams of strangers in expensive cars or federal agents asking uncomfortable questions. In his last conscious thought before sleep claimed him, he imagined Samuel Reeves finally finding the peace that had eluded him for 60 years. Luke found Sarah's letter on a Thursday morning, tucked between the pages of her favorite cookbook, the one she'd used to plan family dinners, when their biggest worry was whether Ellie would eat her vegetables. The envelope was sealed and marked in Sarah's careful handwriting, "For Luke, when the weight gets too heavy." He'd been searching through their bedroom dresser for Ellie's birth certificate, needed for some bureaucratic requirement related to the diamond investigation, when he'd accidentally knocked the cookbook from the nightstand. The letter had fallen out, landing at his feet like a message delivered at exactly the right moment. Luke sat on their bed, the same bed where Sarah had spent her final weeks, where they'd had whispered conversations about Ellie's future and his fears about raising their daughter alone, and opened the envelope with trembling hands. "My dearest Luke," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've encountered something that's testing your faith in what matters most. I'm writing this on one of my better days, when the medicine is working and I can think clearly about the life you'll have to live without me." Luke paused, hearing Sarah's voice so clearly in her written words that he glanced toward the bedroom door, half expecting to see her standing there with the gentle smile that had carried them through every crisis they'd faced together. "I know you'll try to solve every problem with money, because that's how you think about protecting the people you love. You'll work longer hours, take on extra shifts, sacrifice your own needs to make sure Ellie has everything she could want. But sweetheart, I need you to remember something. The most valuable things in life can't be bought, and the most important problems can't be solved with a bigger bank account." The letter continued for 2 pages, covering topics that Sarah couldn't have anticipated but somehow understood perfectly. She wrote about the temptation to choose security over principle, about the difference between providing for Ellie and teaching her how to live with integrity, about the kind of man she hoped Luke would be after she was gone. When you face a choice between doing what's profitable and doing what's right, Sarah had written, I want you to think about the story you want to tell Ellie about her father. I want you to choose the story that will make her proud, even if it makes life harder in the short term. Our daughter is going to learn how to be a good person by watching how you handle difficult decisions. Luke read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of wisdom that Sarah had somehow compressed into her final message. She had known him well enough to predict exactly the kind of moral dilemma he would face, and she had provided guidance that felt as relevant as if she'd written it yesterday. The letter ended with words that broke Luke's heart and healed it simultaneously. I'm not afraid of dying, Luke. I'm afraid of you forgetting who you are after I'm gone. You're the most decent man I've ever known, and that decency is worth more than any treasure you could find. Trust yourself. Trust our daughter's instincts, and remember that love is the only wealth that multiplies when you give it away. Luke folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the cookbook, understanding now why Sarah had hidden it there. She had known that when he needed her guidance most, he would be looking for the simple comforts of their shared life together, the recipes she'd used to feed their family, the annotations she'd made in the margins, the evidence of all the ordinary moments that had added up to extraordinary love. That afternoon, Agent Harrison called with news that would change everything. Mr. Brennan, we've made contact with Isabelle Dubois. She's agreed to speak with you directly, if you're willing. Luke felt his heart racing. She wants to talk to me? She does. But there's something you should know first. Mrs. Dubois isn't interested in simply reclaiming the diamond. She wants to understand how you found it and what you plan to do with it. She's been hurt before by people who claimed to have information about her family's stolen property, but were actually trying to scam her. Luke understood her caution. An elderly woman who had been searching for a valuable family heirloom for decades would naturally attract the attention of people with less honorable intentions. What does she want to know? Everything. How you found it, why you decided to investigate its history, what made you choose to contact us instead of trying to sell it quietly. Mr. Brennan, this woman has spent 70 years wondering what happened to her father's diamond. She needs to trust that you're genuinely trying to do the right thing. Luke agreed to a phone call that was scheduled for the following morning. He spent the evening trying to prepare for a conversation that would require him to explain decisions he barely understood himself. How could he tell an elderly French woman that his 7-year-old daughter had been receiving dream visits from her deceased mother, and that those dreams had guided his moral choices? How could he explain that returning her diamond felt right in ways that had nothing to do with logic or legal requirements? The phone call came at exactly 10 o'clock, with Agent Harrison facilitating the introduction before stepping back to let Luke and Isabel speak directly. When Luke heard her voice accented English, delivered with the careful precision of someone speaking a second language, he was struck by its strength and clarity. Mr. Brennan, Isabel said, Agent Harrison tells me you found my father's diamond in your garden. I believe so. Yes, ma'am. I'm very sorry it took so long to find you. Isabel was quiet for a moment before responding. Mr. Brennan, do you know what that diamond represented to my family? Luke admitted that he knew only what Agent Harrison had told him, that it had been stolen during the war and had belonged to her father. My father was a jeweler, Isabel explained. He created that diamond for my mother as an engagement gift. It took him 3 years to find the right stone and another year to cut it perfectly. It was the most beautiful thing he ever made, and it represented everything he hoped to build with the woman he loved. She paused, and Luke could hear the weight of decades in her silence. When the war came, my father buried his most precious things to keep them safe from the soldiers who were taking everything of value from French families. The diamond was the last piece of my parents' love story, the only thing I had left of the life they built together before everything was destroyed. Luke felt tears building in his eyes as he listened to Isabel's story. The diamond wasn't just a valuable stone, it was a symbol of love that had survived war, displacement, and decades of searching. Returning it wouldn't just restore her property, it would return a piece of her parents' legacy that she had thought was lost forever. "Mrs. Dubois," Luke said carefully, "I want you to have your father's diamond back. No conditions, no complications. It belongs to you." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Luke wondered if the connection had been lost. When Isabel finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Mr. Brennan, do you understand what you are giving up? That diamond is worth millions of dollars. It could change your life completely." "Yes, ma'am, I understand. But it's already changed my life. Finding it taught me something about the difference between what's valuable and what's important." Isabel made a sound that might have been crying or laughing. "You sound like my father. He used to say that the most precious things cannot be bought or sold, only given and received." They talked for another hour, with Isabel sharing stories about her parents and her childhood in France, and Luke telling her about Ellie and their life in the small house where the diamond had waited 60 years to be found. By the end of the conversation, Luke felt as if he'd gained a grandmother for Ellie and a perspective on their discovery that he couldn't have imagined when he first struck something hard with his garden shovel. "Mr. Brennan," Isabel said as their call was ending, "there is something I want to ask you. When you return my father's diamond, would you consider keeping something in exchange?" Luke was confused. "I don't understand. There were other pieces that my father buried with the diamond, things of less monetary value, but great sentimental importance. I would like you to choose something from my family's collection, something to remember this moment when strangers became friends across an ocean." The offer touched Luke more deeply than any amount of money could have. Isabel wasn't just reclaiming her inheritance. She was offering to share it with the man who had chosen to do what was right rather than what was profitable. That evening, as Luke tucked Ellie into bed, she looked up at him with her mother's eyes and asked, "Are you happy now, Daddy?" Luke considered the question seriously. He was about to lose his job. He was giving up millions of dollars. Their financial problems hadn't been solved, and their quiet life had been permanently disrupted. But for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt genuinely at peace with a major decision. "Yes, sweetheart, I think I am." Ellie smiled and closed her eyes. "Mama said you would be." As Luke turned off her bedroom light, he realized that his daughter had been right all along. The diamond had brought them exactly what they needed, not money, but the chance to discover what kind of people they wanted to be when faced with an impossible choice. The historical map arrived on Friday morning, delivered by a courier service that required Luke's signature and asked for 2 forms of identification before handing over the thick manila envelope. Agent Harrison had arranged for it to be sent from the National Archives, part of his ongoing research into the Dubois family's wartime experiences and the circumstances surrounding the diamond's original theft. Luke spread the map across his kitchen table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs to keep the fragile paper flat. The document was a detailed survey of a French village called Saint-Rémy-sur-Loire, dated 1943 and marked with notations in both French and English. Red circles indicated buildings that had housed American troops, while blue squares marked known resistance safe houses, and yellow triangles showed locations where valuables had reportedly been hidden from German forces. One particular notation made Luke's breath catch in his throat. A small house on the village's eastern edge was marked with both a red circle and handwritten notes in English. "Dubois family, jeweler shop below, residence above. American soldier Samuel Reeves billeted here Feb-March 1943. Family reported theft of valuable diamond after unit transfer." But it was a second notation, written in different handwriting and dated 6 months later, that changed everything Luke thought he understood about their situation. Heinrich Brennan, German-American translator, attached to 506th Intelligence Unit, investigated theft reports. Family trust established through Red Cross. See attached documentation. Luke stared at the name, his mind racing through impossible connections. Heinrich Brennan, His grandfather, who had died when Luke was 12, had been named Heinrich. Family stories had always mentioned his grandfather's service during World War II, but Luke had never known the details. Heinrich had rarely spoken about the war, and Luke's father had inherited his silence on the subject. With shaking hands, Luke pulled out his phone and called his father. "Dad, I need to ask you about Grandpa Heinrich. Did he serve in France during the war?" His father, Michael, was quiet for a moment. "Luke, where is this coming from? You know your grandfather never talked about his service." "Dad, please. This is important. Was he involved in investigating thefts by American soldiers?" Another pause, longer this time. "Luke, how could you possibly know about that?" The question hit Luke like a physical blow. "You knew. I found some papers after he died. Official documents, reports he'd written about American soldiers stealing from French families. It nearly destroyed him." "Luke, he spent years after the war trying to track down families who had been robbed, trying to make restitution with his own money when he couldn't find the stolen property." Luke felt the room spinning around him. "Dad, I need you to come over. Right now. There's something I have to show you." Michael arrived within an hour, carrying a shoebox that Luke had never seen before. Inside were documents that Luke's grandfather had apparently hidden for decades, official reports, correspondence with Red Cross officials, and personal notes about his attempts to contact French families whose property had been stolen by American troops. But it was a letter at the bottom of the box that revealed the truth Luke had never suspected. Written in Heinrich Brennan's careful handwriting and addressed to "my future family," it explained a secret he had carried to his grave. "I have spent 30 years searching for a French family named Dubois," the letter began. "An American soldier under my command stole a valuable diamond from them, and though I recovered the stone after his death in 1973, I was never able to locate the family to return it. I have established a trust fund that will provide for the diamond's care and maintenance until the rightful owners can be found." Luke's hands trembled as he read his grandfather's confession. Heinrich Brennan had found Samuel Reeves after the war, had recovered the stolen diamond, and had spent decades trying to return it to the Dubois family. When his search proved unsuccessful, he had made a decision that would impact generations of both families. "I have buried the diamond in the garden of the house I purchased on Maple Street." Heinrich's letter continued, "My son Michael knows nothing of this, and I pray that my grandchildren will forgive an old man's attempt to balance the scales of justice. If this stone is ever found by my family, I trust them to complete the mission. I could not finish returning it to the French family who lost everything to war and theft." Luke looked up at his father, who was reading the letter over his shoulder with an expression of stunned disbelief. "Dad, did you know any of this?" Michael shook his head slowly. "I knew he'd bought the house on Maple Street as an investment property, but he never lived there. He rented it out for 40 years, always to tenants who wouldn't do extensive gardening. I thought it was just another one of his eccentric business decisions." Luke realized that his grandfather had been protecting the diamond for 6 decades, waiting for the right moment and the right person to discover it. Heinrich had chosen to buy the house where Samuel Reeves had lived, had buried the diamond in the same soil where it had waited during Reeves's guilty vigil, and had ensured through his estate planning that the property would eventually come to Luke and Sarah through a complex series of sales and transfers that had seemed like coincidence. "Luke," Michael said quietly, "your grandfather left specific instructions in his will about this property. If the diamond was ever found by family members, we were supposed to use his trust fund to research its provenance and return it to its rightful owners." Luke felt a chill as the full scope of his grandfather's plan became clear. Heinrich Brennan had orchestrated every aspect of this discovery, from ensuring that Luke would inherit the house to providing the financial resources needed to complete the investigation. Even the timing seemed deliberate. The diamond had been found when Luke was struggling financially, when he would be most tempted to keep it, when the moral choice would be most difficult and most meaningful. "There's more," Michael said, pulling another document from the shoebox. Your grandfather's trust fund contains enough money to cover all your expenses while this situation gets resolved. He knew that doing the right thing might cost you financially, so he made provisions to ensure you could afford to be honest. Luke stared at the trust fund documentation, struggling to process the magnitude of his grandfather's foresight. Heinrich Brennan had anticipated every complication, every temptation, every practical concern that might prevent his grandson from completing the mission he'd been unable to finish himself. "Dad, why didn't you tell me about any of this when I inherited the house?" Michael looked uncomfortable. "Because your grandfather's instructions were very specific. You were supposed to discover the diamond naturally, make your own choice about what to do with it, and only then learn about the trust fund and his wishes. He wanted you to choose to do the right thing because it was right, not because you'd been told to do it." Luke thought about Ellie's dreams, about her conviction that the diamond belonged to someone else, about his own growing certainty that keeping it would be wrong. His grandfather had trusted that the values Heinrich had tried to instill in his family would guide Luke toward the correct decision, even without knowing the full story. That afternoon, Luke called Agent Harrison with the information about his grandfather's involvement. Harrison listened to the story with growing amazement, occasionally asking for clarification about dates and documentation. "Mr. Brennan," Harrison said finally, "this is extraordinary. Your grandfather's records are going to solve several cases that have been open for decades, and his trust fund is going to make it possible to return stolen property to families across Europe who thought they'd never see their inheritances again. What happens now? Now we contact Mrs. Dubois and tell her that the diamond is coming home, not just because you chose to do the right thing, but because your grandfather spent 60 years planning for this moment." That evening, as Luke helped Ellie with her bath, she asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Daddy, was your grandfather a good man?" Luke paused, thinking about Heinrich Brennan's decades-long mission to right a wrong he hadn't committed, his careful planning to ensure justice would eventually prevail, his trust that future generations would honor values he'd never explicitly taught. "Yes, sweetheart, I think he was a very good man." Ellie nodded seriously. "Mama said he's been watching over us, making sure we do the right thing." Luke finished rinsing Ellie's hair in silence, marveling at his daughter's continued connection to wisdom that seemed to transcend her 7 years. Whether through dreams, intuition, or something deeper than either, Ellie had guided him toward a decision that fulfilled a promise made by a grandfather she'd never met to a family she'd never known. The diamond that had seemed like a random discovery was actually the culmination of a multi-generational story about sacrifice, responsibility, and the patient work of justice. Luke was not just returning stolen property. He was completing a mission that had been passed down through his family like a sacred trust, waiting for the right moment and the right choice to bring decades of careful planning to its intended conclusion. The community petition started as a simple conversation between Luke and Mrs. Chen over their shared garden fence on Saturday morning. Luke had been explaining his decision to return the diamond to its rightful owner, expecting perhaps a polite nod of understanding. Instead, Mrs. Chen had listened with growing indignation about the corporate pressure and media circus that had invaded their quiet neighborhood. "This is not right," Mrs. Chen had declared, her usually gentle voice sharp with anger. "You try to do good thing, and these people make it about money and greed. They bring chaos to our street, scare children, and treat you like criminal for being honest man." Within hours, Mrs. Chen had organized something Luke had never seen in their neighborhood, a grassroots movement of residents who were tired of watching their community be exploited by outside interests. The petition began simply, "We support Luke Brennan's right to make moral choices without harassment," but it quickly evolved into something more significant. Mrs. Chen had recruited Harold, her electrician husband, who had connections throughout the city's trade unions. Harold brought in Pete Morrison, whose late wife had been a retired teacher with a network of community activists. Pete contacted the Morales family, who had relationships with local Hispanic community organizations. By Sunday afternoon, the petition had grown from a neighborhood complaint to a movement that included veterans groups, church congregations, and civic organizations from across the city. Luke watched the developing coalition with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. He had expected criticism for giving up millions of dollars, not community support for his decision. But as neighbors he barely knew stopped by to express their admiration for his choice, Luke began to understand that his situation had touched something deeper than financial envy. "You're showing people that money doesn't have to win," explained Maria Santos, a local church organizer who had brought a clipboard full of signatures to Luke's door. "In a world where everything seems to be about profit and getting ahead, you're proving that some things matter more than wealth." The corporate interests hadn't given up, however. David Wells, the polished representative from Meridian Acquisitions, had returned with reinforcements, a team of lawyers, financial advisors, and what appeared to be a public relations specialist. They had set up a temporary office in a rented storefront 3 blocks from Luke's house, and their presence was impossible to ignore. On Monday morning, Wells called Luke directly with an offer that was clearly designed to be irresistible. "Mr. Brennan, I understand you've made contact with someone claiming to be the diamond's rightful owner. But before you make any irreversible decisions, I want you to consider what we're prepared to offer for immediate acquisition of the stone." Luke had been expecting this call. "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Wells." $10 million, Wells said without pause. "Cash, delivered within 48 hours, no questions asked about provenance or ownership history. You could secure your daughter's future, pay off every debt you have, and still have enough left over to live comfortably for the rest of your life." The number was larger than Luke had imagined anyone would offer, large enough to solve every financial problem he'd ever had, and many he'd never thought to worry about. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what $10 million could mean for Ellie's education, their housing situation, their long-term security. "Mr. Brennan, are you still there?" "I'm here," Luke said, "and my answer is still no." Wells's voice took on a harder edge. "Mr. Brennan, I don't think you understand the legal complications you're creating for yourself. By making contact with this French woman, you've potentially exposed yourself to international legal issues that could tie up the diamond for years. Even if you eventually win the right to keep it, the legal costs could bankrupt you." Luke recognized the shift from temptation to intimidation, but he also heard something else in Wells's voice: desperation. The man was pushing harder because his previous approach hadn't worked, which suggested that Luke held more power in this situation than he'd realized. "Mr. Wells, I appreciate your offer, but I've made my decision. The diamond is going back to its rightful owner." "Think about your daughter," Wells said, his professional facade finally cracking. "Think about what you're taking away from her future. Is your conscience worth more than her college education? Is doing what feels good worth more than financial security?" Luke hung up without answering, but Wells's words echoed in his mind for the rest of the day. The decision to return the diamond had felt right in his heart, but his head kept calculating what he was giving up. $10 million would ensure that Ellie never had to worry about money, never had to make the kind of difficult choices that had defined Luke's adult life. That evening, Agent Harrison called with an update that complicated everything further. "Mr. Brennan, we've hit a snag with the Dubois situation. Mrs. Dubois is elderly and in poor health, and her family in Canada is questioning whether she's competent to make decisions about valuable property. They're concerned that she's being taken advantage of by people who want to exploit her emotional attachment to family history." Luke felt his heart sink. "What does that mean?" "It means that even though you want to return the diamond and she wants to receive it, we may not be legally authorized to complete the transfer. Her family has hired lawyers who are claiming that any agreements she makes regarding the diamond should be reviewed by the courts to ensure she's not being manipulated." Luke understood the family's concerns, but he also realized that legal challenges could delay the return indefinitely. Meanwhile, the corporate pressure would continue, the media attention would intensify, and his family's life would remain in chaos. "There's something else," Harrison continued. "Mrs. Dubois asked me to give you a message. She said to tell you that her father used to say, 'Patience is the final ingredient in every recipe for justice.' She wants you to know that she's been waiting 70 years for this moment, and she can wait a little longer if it means doing everything properly." The message carried a dignity that made Luke's chest tighten with emotion. Isabelle Dubois was facing legal challenges from her own family, questioning of her mental competence, and delays that might prevent her from ever seeing her father's diamond again. Yet she was more concerned with reassuring Luke than with expressing frustration about the obstacles. Tuesday morning brought a development that changed the entire dynamic of their situation. Luke woke to find news vans lined up along Maple Street, but these weren't the local reporters who had been covering the story for the past week. These were network television crews, satellite trucks, and what appeared to be international media representatives. Mrs. Chen knocked on Luke's back door at 7:30, her face flushed with excitement and concern. "Luke, dear, you need to see the morning news. Your story is everywhere." Luke turned on his television to find his house featured prominently on 3 different news channels. The story had apparently been picked up by national media as an example of moral choice in modern America, with commentators debating whether Luke's decision represented admirable principles or foolish idealism. But it was a segment on an international news program that made Luke's heart race. A reporter in Montreal had interviewed Isabelle Dubois in her assisted living facility, and the elderly woman's grace and dignity in explaining her 7-decade search for her father's diamond had captured global attention. "I never expected to see it again," Isabelle said in the interview, her English clear despite her accent. "But this young man in America, this Mr. Brennan, he chooses to give back what belongs to me instead of keeping what could make him rich. This gives me hope that there are still good people in the world." The interviewer had asked about her family's legal challenge to her competence, and Isabelle's response had been delivered with quiet strength. "I have been taking care of myself for 86 years. I think I can decide what to do with my father's diamond." By noon, Luke's phone was ringing constantly with interview requests, book deal offers, and movie production companies interested in their story. He stopped answering calls from numbers he didn't recognize, but the voicemail messages piled up faster than he could delete them. Ellie seemed remarkably unaffected by the chaos surrounding their house. She spent Tuesday afternoon in the backyard, drawing pictures in her dream journal, while reporters and cameras documented their daily life from the street. When Luke asked if the attention bothered her, she looked up from her notebook with her mother's serene expression. "Mama says it's almost over," Ellie reported matter-of-factly. "She says all the noise is because people forgot what's important, but they're starting to remember." That evening, Danny arrived with news that Luke had been dreading. His brother carried a folder full of documents and wore the expression of someone delivering unpleasant but necessary information. "Luke, I've been talking to lawyers about your situation. You need to understand the legal exposure you're creating for yourself." Danny spread contracts and legal analyses across Luke's kitchen table, pointing to sections highlighted in yellow. "If you voluntarily give up the diamond, and it turns out that you had legal right to keep it, you could be liable for damages to Ellie's financial future. If she decides to sue you when she turns 18, claiming that you deprived her of her inheritance, you could lose everything you've worked for." Luke studied the documents, recognizing the validity of Danny's concerns, while also feeling frustrated by their focus on legal liability rather than moral responsibility. "Danny, I understand the risks, but I also understand what's right." "Right? According to who?" Danny's voice carried the edge of someone who had been losing an argument for days. "Luke, you're making decisions based on a 7-year-old's dreams and some old man's guilt from 70 years ago. You're not thinking about the practical realities of your situation." "Maybe the practical realities aren't the most important thing here." Danny stared at his brother as if Luke had announced his intention to join a cult. Luke, $10 million is sitting on the table. $10 million that could solve every problem you've ever had. And you're walking away from it because a French woman you've never met says it belonged to her grandfather. Her father, Luke corrected quietly. Her father, her grandfather, whatever. Luke, this is insane. You're choosing to remain poor when you could choose to be rich. You're choosing uncertainty when you could choose security. And you're making that choice for Ellie too, whether she understands it or not. Luke looked toward his daughter's room, where Ellie was sleeping peacefully, despite the media circus outside their windows. Danny's arguments had merit from a practical standpoint, but they felt wrong in ways that Luke couldn't fully articulate. Danny, what if keeping the diamond would make me rich, but cost me something more important than money? Like what? Like the ability to look my daughter in the eye and tell her that I did the right thing when it mattered most. Wednesday morning brought the news that would force everything to a head. Agent Harrison called with an update that carried both good and bad implications. Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Dubois' competency hearing has been expedited. It's scheduled for Friday morning in Montreal. If the court rules that she's mentally competent to make decisions about her property, we can proceed with the return immediately. If they rule that she's not competent, the diamond could be tied up in legal proceedings for months or years. Luke felt the weight of the decision crystallizing around him. Friday morning would determine whether his choice to return the diamond could be completed quickly or whether he'd be trapped in legal limbo while corporate interests and media attention continued to tear apart his family's life. There's something else, Harrison continued. Mrs. Dubois has requested that you testify at her competency hearing. She wants the court to hear directly from you about your decision to return the diamond and your interactions with her. She believes that your testimony will demonstrate her mental clarity and judgment. Luke realized that his moral choice had evolved into something much larger than a simple decision about returning stolen property. He was now part of a legal proceeding that would determine an elderly woman's right to control her own life and property, and his testimony could be the factor that decided the outcome. Mr. Brennan, Harrison said, I need to ask you directly. Are you prepared to travel to Montreal and testify on Mrs. Dubois' behalf? Because if you are, we need to make arrangements immediately. Luke looked around his kitchen, taking in the evidence of their quiet life that had been so dramatically disrupted by his discovery. The coffee cups on the counter, the children's drawings on the refrigerator, the simple routines that had defined their days before the diamond changed everything. Yes, Luke said without hesitation. I'll testify. Mrs. Dubois deserves to have her competence recognized, and she deserves to get her father's diamond back. As Luke hung up the phone, he realized that his choice to return the diamond had evolved into something much more significant than he'd anticipated. He wasn't just completing his grandfather's mission or fulfilling a moral obligation. He was taking a public stand for values that seemed increasingly rare in a world dominated by financial considerations. Friday morning in Montreal would be more than a competency hearing. It would be a test of whether dignity, integrity, and moral choice could prevail over legal technicalities and family disputes. And Luke would be there to ensure that Isabelle Dubois got the chance to reclaim not just her father's diamond, but her right to make her own decisions about the legacy she'd been searching for her entire life. The courthouse steps in Montreal were crowded with reporters, supporters, and curious onlookers when Luke arrived on Friday morning. He had flown up the night before, leaving Ellie with Mrs. Chen and carrying the diamond in a secure case provided by Agent Harrison. The weight of the stone seemed heavier now, freighted with the expectations of everyone who had followed their story. Isabelle Dubois was already there, seated in a wheelchair, not because she couldn't walk, but because her lawyers had insisted on presenting her as frail and potentially vulnerable. Luke could see the frustration in her eyes as she navigated questions from reporters who seemed more interested in the spectacle than the substance of her situation. When Luke approached, Isabelle's face brightened with recognition, despite the fact that they had never met in person. She extended a weathered hand that trembled slightly but gripped his with surprising strength. "Mr. Brennan," she said in accented English that carried decades of dignity, "thank you for coming so far to help an old woman reclaim her past." Luke knelt beside her wheelchair, ignoring the cameras documenting their meeting. "Mrs. Dubois, it's an honor to meet you. And it's not help, it's just returning what was always yours." Isabel studied his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read character through years of disappointment and betrayal. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once and patted his hand with maternal affection. "You have your grandfather's eyes," she said softly. "Agent Harrison showed me Heinrich's photograph from his military records. Good men often pass their goodness to their children, even when they think no one is watching." The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock, but by 9:30, the courtroom was packed with family members, lawyers, media representatives, and supporters who had traveled from across Canada to witness what had become a symbol of elder rights and international reconciliation. Luke recognized several faces from the news coverage: Isabel's nieces and nephews who had challenged her competency, their lawyers who looked confident and well-prepared, and a scattering of elderly people who seemed to view Isabel's case as relevant to their own struggles for autonomy. Luke's testimony was scheduled for the middle of the hearing, after medical experts had evaluated Isabel's cognitive function and before her family presented their concerns about financial exploitation. He spent the morning listening to psychologists and doctors describe Isabel's mental state in clinical terms that seemed to miss the essential dignity and clarity he had experienced in their phone conversations. When Luke was called to testify, he approached the witness stand with the same nervous energy he'd felt before job interviews and parent-teacher conferences, moments when his words would have consequences beyond his immediate control. The judge, a woman in her 60s who seemed to balance compassion with legal rigor, asked Luke to explain his decision to contact authorities about the diamond rather than attempting to sell it quietly. "Your Honor," Luke began, "when I found the diamond, my first thought was about the money it could bring my family. We've struggled financially since my wife's death, and that stone represented security we'd never imagined possible." Luke paused, looking toward Isabel, who was watching him with encouraging eyes. "But the more I learned about the diamond's history, the more I realized that keeping it would mean building my daughter's future on someone else's loss." Mrs. Dubois had been searching for her father's diamond for 70 years. She'd hired investigators, placed advertisements, contacted veterans organizations. She never gave up hope that she'd find the last piece of her father's legacy. The prosecutor representing Isabel's family interrupted with an objection about the relevance of Luke's emotional impressions, but the judge allowed him to continue. "Your Honor, in my conversations with Mrs. Dubois, I found her to be incredibly sharp, emotionally stable, and completely clear about what the diamond meant to her family. She understood the financial value, but she also understood the symbolic importance of recovering something that connected her to her parents' love story." Luke described their phone conversations in detail, emphasizing Isabel's clear memory of historical events, her sophisticated understanding of legal procedures, and her thoughtful questions about Luke's family and motivations. "Mrs. Dubois asked me about my daughter, about my wife's death, about my grandfather's military service. She remembered details from our conversations weeks later. She expressed concern about the financial sacrifice I was making and offered to share some of her father's other recovered items as compensation. These aren't the actions or concerns of someone who lacks mental capacity." When the family's lawyer cross-examined Luke, the questions focused on his financial situation and the potential influence that might have on his perspective. "Mr. Brennan, isn't it true that you're currently unemployed and facing significant financial pressures?" "Yes, sir." "And isn't it true that Mrs. Dubois' emotional response to your contact might have influenced your perception of her mental state?" Luke considered the question carefully. "Sir." Mrs. Dubois' emotional response to recovering her father's diamond seemed entirely appropriate to me. If I'd been searching for something important for 70 years and someone offered to return it, I'd be emotional too. But her emotions didn't cloud her judgment. They informed it. The lawyer pressed harder. Mr. Brennan, given your financial situation, isn't it possible that you're supporting Mrs. Dubois' competency because doing so allows you to feel better about giving up millions of dollars? Luke felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. Sir, I'm supporting Mrs. Dubois' competency because I've experienced it firsthand. She's earned the right to make her own decisions about her own property. When Isabel took the stand for her own testimony, Luke watched her transform from the frail, elderly woman her family's lawyers had presented into the sharp, determined person he had come to know through their conversations. She answered questions about dates, places, and people with accuracy that surprised even her own family members. She demonstrated understanding of financial concepts, legal procedures, and the implications of her decisions. But it was her explanation of why she wanted the diamond returned that carried the most emotional weight. Your Honor, Isabel said in her careful English, this diamond is not about money for me. I have lived 86 years, and I do not need millions of dollars to be happy now. But this diamond is the last thing I have from my father's hands, the last piece of the love story he built with my mother before the war destroyed everything. She looked toward Luke, sitting in the gallery, and smiled. Mr. Brennan could have kept this diamond, could have solved all his problems with money, but he chose to give an old woman back her history instead. This is not the action of someone who lacks judgment. This is the action of someone who understands what truly matters in life. Isabel turned back to the judge, her voice strengthening with conviction. I want this diamond back, not because I am being manipulated or because I cannot think clearly. I want it back because it represents the victory of love over theft, of justice over convenience, of human goodness over human greed. I have been waiting 70 years for this moment, and I am completely capable of deciding what it means to me. The hearing recessed for lunch, but Luke barely noticed the food on his plate. He found himself thinking about Ellie, wondering what she was doing with Mrs. Chen, hoping that his decision to travel to Montreal wouldn't create new problems for their already disrupted life. When court reconvened, the judge delivered her ruling with the measured authority of someone who understood the broader implications of her decision. This court finds that Mrs. Isabelle Dubois demonstrates clear mental competency to make decisions regarding her personal property. Her memory is excellent, her reasoning is sound, and her understanding of the consequences of her choices is complete. The concerns raised by her family, while understandable, do not constitute evidence of diminished capacity. Luke felt his heart racing as the judge continued. Furthermore, this court is impressed by the moral clarity demonstrated by Mr. Brennan in choosing to return valuable property to its rightful owner rather than pursuing personal financial gain. His testimony regarding Mrs. Dubois's mental state is credible and compelling. The judge looked directly at Isabel, who was sitting straighter in her wheelchair than she had all day. Mrs. Dubois, this court recognizes your right to reclaim your father's diamond and to make your own decisions about its disposition. The return will proceed as planned. The courtroom erupted in applause, but Luke's attention was focused entirely on Isabel's face. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but her expression carried a peace that spoke of burdens finally lifted and justice finally served. The ceremony took place in a small room adjacent to the courthouse, with only Agent Harrison, a court clerk, and 2 witnesses present. Luke had expected something formal and bureaucratic, but Isabel had requested privacy for the moment when her father's diamond would finally return to her family after 7 decades of separation. Luke opened the secure case with hands that trembled slightly, revealing the stone that had changed both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. Under the soft, fluorescent lighting of the court building, the diamond seemed to pulse with captured light, as beautiful and impossible as it had been on that Tuesday morning when Luke first pulled it from the earth. Isabel reached out with both hands, her fingers barely steady enough to accept the weight of the stone. When her skin made contact with the faceted surface, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply, as if she was trying to absorb not just the physical presence of the diamond, but the memories and emotions it represented. "Papa," she whispered in French, her voice so soft that Luke almost missed the word. Then, switching to English, "He is home now." Luke watched Isabel cradle the diamond against her chest, and for a moment he could see past her 86 years to the young woman who had survived war, displacement, and decades of searching. The stone that had represented financial salvation to Luke was clearly something much more profound to Isabel, a connection to family, to love, to a time before loss had defined her life. "Mr. Brennan," Isabel said, looking up from the diamond with eyes that sparkled with unshed tears, "there is something I want to give you." She reached into a small cloth bag that her nurse had been carrying and withdrew an object wrapped in tissue paper. When Luke unwrapped it, he found a simple gold locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful in its understated elegance. "This belonged to my mother," Isabel explained. "My father made it for their first anniversary. It is not worth millions of dollars, but it carries something more valuable than money. It carries the love between two people who built something beautiful together." Luke opened the locket to find two small photographs, faded but still clear enough to show a young couple gazing at each other with obvious affection. The man had the hands of someone who worked with precision and care, while the woman had eyes that reminded Luke of Isabel's determined spirit. "I want you to have this," Isabel continued, "not as payment for returning my father's diamond, but as a reminder that some kinds of wealth can only be shared, never sold." Luke felt his throat tighten as he accepted the locket. The gesture carried more emotional weight than any amount of money could have provided. It was Isabel's way of making him part of her family's story, of ensuring that their connection would outlast the return of the diamond. "Mrs. Dubois, I can't accept something this personal." "You can, and you will," Isabel interrupted, with the gentle firmness of someone who had earned the right to make such decisions. "My parents had something beautiful together, just as you and your wife had something beautiful. Your daughter should grow up knowing that love creates treasures that cannot be stolen, only shared." Agent Harrison completed the official documentation while Luke and Isabel sat together in comfortable silence. The legal transfer was surprisingly simple after all the complications that had preceded it. A few signatures, a court stamp, and the diamond officially belonged to Isabel Dubois once again. "Mr. Brennan," Harrison said as he packed up his paperwork, "I've been investigating art and property crimes for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this case. What you've done today is going to be remembered for a long time." Luke shook his head. "I just returned something that wasn't mine to keep." "You did much more than that," Isabel said firmly. "You proved that there are still people in the world who choose to do what is right instead of what is profitable. You gave an old woman back her history, but you also gave the world back a little faith in human goodness." That evening, Luke flew home to find his neighborhood transformed. The media circus had largely dispersed, but something else had taken its place, a quiet celebration that seemed to emerge organically from the community that had supported his decision. Mrs. Chen had organized a block party, with neighbors contributing food and decorations for what she called a feast to honor honest choices. Ellie ran to Luke as soon as he stepped out of the taxi, launching herself into his arms with the enthusiasm of someone who had missed him far more than their brief separation should have warranted. "Daddy, did you give the pretty stone back to the sad lady?" "I did, sweetheart, and she's not sad anymore." Ellie pulled back to study his face with the serious expression she wore when evaluating adult behavior. "Are you sad that we don't have the pretty stone anymore?" Luke considered the question, taking inventory of his emotions after two of the most intense days of his life. He was tired, emotionally drained, and still facing the practical problems that had existed before he'd found the diamond. But sad? No, he wasn't sad. "No, Ellie, I'm not sad. I'm proud. "Mama said you would be proud," Ellie reported matter-of-factly. "She said giving back what doesn't belong to you is how you keep your heart clean." As the evening progressed, Luke found himself surrounded by neighbors who wanted to express their admiration for his choice. Pete Morrison pumped his hand with the enthusiasm of someone congratulating a war hero. The Morales family brought a casserole and a card signed by their extended family. Even people Luke barely knew stopped by to offer words of support and encouragement. But it was a conversation with Harold Chen that provided the perspective Luke needed to understand what had really happened over the past week. "Luke," Harold said as they stood together in Luke's backyard, looking at the spot where the diamond had been buried for 60 years. "You know what you really did with this whole situation?" Luke shook his head, genuinely curious about Harold's perspective. "You reminded all of us that we have choices," Harold said simply. "Every day, we make decisions about what kind of people we want to be, what kind of community we want to live in, what kind of world we want to leave for our children. Most of the time, those choices seem small and private, but sometimes somebody makes a choice that's big enough and public enough to remind the rest of us what's possible." Harold gestured toward the neighbors scattered across Luke's lawn, sharing food and conversation under the early evening sky. "Look around, Luke. When's the last time you saw this many neighbors in one place, talking to each other, caring about each other? You didn't just return a diamond to an old lady in Canada. You reminded all of us that we're part of something bigger than our individual problems." As Luke tucked Ellie into bed that night, she looked up at him with her mother's eyes and asked one final question about their adventure. "Daddy, do you think Mama is proud of us?" Luke thought about Sarah's hidden letter, about her guidance to choose the story that would make Ellie proud, about her conviction that love was the only wealth that multiplied when shared. "Yes, sweetheart, I think she's very proud of us." Ellie smiled and closed her eyes, apparently satisfied with his answer. As Luke turned off her bedroom light, he noticed that her dream journal was open on the nightstand, filled with pictures of smiling figures and bright colors. Whatever dreams came to Ellie now, they seemed to carry hope rather than sadness. Luke walked through his small house, checking locks and turning off lights, performing the ordinary rituals of security that marked the end of extraordinary days. The diamond was gone, returned to its rightful owner after decades of waiting. The media attention had faded, leaving behind a quiet that felt deeper and more peaceful than Luke had experienced in years. But something had been gained that was worth more than any gemstone. Luke had discovered that he was capable of making difficult choices for the right reasons, that his community was full of people who valued integrity over profit, and that his daughter was growing up with a moral compass that would guide her through whatever challenges life might bring. The garden where everything had started looked ordinary in the moonlight, just a small patch of earth where a father and daughter had been planting seeds, hoping for growth, trusting in the future. Tomorrow, Luke would start looking for a new job. He would pay bills, help Ellie with homework, and continue the daily work of building a life worth living. But tonight, as he finally drifted towards sleep, Luke felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had been tested and had chosen well. The diamond was gone, but something infinitely more valuable remained: the knowledge that when it mattered most, he had been the kind of man his wife would have been proud to love, and his daughter could be proud to call father. 6 months later, Luke stood in the same corner of his backyard where everything had begun. But this time, he wasn't alone. Ellie knelt beside him, carefully planting seeds from a packet that had arrived in the mail from Montreal, along with a letter from Isabelle Dubois, written in her careful handwriting. "These are heritage tomatoes," Ellie read from Isabelle's letter, sounding out the difficult words with the careful pronunciation of a 7-year-old determined to get everything right. "My father grew them in his garden in France before the war. I saved seeds all these years, hoping someday I could share them with friends who understand that the best things in life are meant to be passed on to others." Luke smiled as he watched his daughter place each seed with the same attention she'd given to their original tomato planting. The garden had been transformed over the past months, expanding from the modest patch where they'd found the diamond to include raised beds built with help from Harold Chen and Pete Morrison. What had started as therapy for Luke had become a neighborhood project, with Mrs. Chen contributing pepper plants, the Morales family sharing herb varieties from their homeland, and other neighbors adding their own contributions to what everyone now called Luke and Ellie's community garden. The job situation had resolved itself in ways Luke hadn't anticipated. Word of his choice to return the diamond had spread through the veteran community, and a construction company specializing in historical restoration had offered him a position that paid better than warehouse work and felt more meaningful. His new supervisor, a Vietnam veteran named Tom Bradley, had explained the company's philosophy during Luke's interview. "We restore old buildings because we believe some things are worth preserving. Sounds like you understand that principle." Luke's financial situation had stabilized without the millions the diamond might have provided. Heinrich Brennan's trust fund, administered through his grandfather's careful estate planning, had covered their expenses during the transition between jobs and had provided a modest college fund for Ellie. More importantly, Luke had discovered that his grandfather's reputation for integrity had opened doors that money alone couldn't have unlocked. The media attention had faded, but the connections it had created remained. Luke received letters regularly from people around the world who had been inspired by his choice to return the diamond. A teacher in Ohio had used their story to start a classroom discussion about moral courage. A businessman in Germany had donated money to refugee organizations after reading about Isabel's family history. A group of teenagers in Australia had organized a community service project they called Operation Diamond, focused on returning lost property to elderly residents in their neighborhood. But it was the ongoing relationship with Isabel that had brought the most unexpected joy to Luke and Ellie's life. They spoke by phone every 2 weeks, with Isabel sharing stories about her childhood in France and Luke updating her on Ellie's progress in school. Isabel had become the grandmother Ellie had never known, offering advice about everything from homework troubles to friendship challenges. "Mr. Brennan," Isabel had said during their most recent conversation, "I want you to know that returning my father's diamond has given me something I never expected to find at my age, a family that chooses to love me instead of being obligated by blood." The diamond itself had found a final resting place that honored both its history and its symbolism. Isabel had donated it to a museum dedicated to Holocaust remembrance and recovery of stolen cultural artifacts. The display included the full story of the diamond's journey, from Henri Dubois' workshop in France, to Samuel Reeves's guilty conscience, to Heinrich Brennan's decades-long mission, to Luke's choice to return. What wasn't his to keep? Luke had attended the dedication ceremony, bringing Ellie to see the culmination of their unexpected adventure. The diamond sat in a place of honor, surrounded by information about wartime theft of cultural property and the ongoing efforts to return stolen artifacts to their rightful owners. But what had moved Luke most was a simple placard beside the diamond that read, "Donated by Isabelle Dubois and returned by Luke Brennan," proving that some treasures gain value when they are shared rather than kept. Ellie had stood in front of the display for a long time, studying the diamond that had once sat on their kitchen table. When Luke asked what she was thinking, she had looked up at him with her mother's thoughtful expression. "It looks happier here," she had said simply, "like it finally found where it was supposed to be." The dreams about Sarah had gradually faded as Ellie's life found new rhythms and purposes, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. Occasionally, Ellie would report a brief visit from Mama, usually carrying messages of encouragement about Luke's parenting or approval of decisions they'd made together. Luke had stopped questioning the reality of these dreams, accepting them as part of the mystery of love that transcends physical presence. As they finished planting Isabel's heritage tomato seeds, Ellie looked up at her father with dirt on her hands and satisfaction in her expression. "Daddy, do you think the seeds will grow into something special?" Luke considered the question, thinking about all the ways their lives had grown and changed since that Tuesday morning when his shovel had struck something hard in the earth. The financial security he'd once worried about had been replaced by something more sustainable, meaningful work, community connections, and the deep satisfaction of choices made for the right reasons. "I think they'll grow into exactly what they're supposed to become," Luke said, helping Ellie to her feet, "just like everything else that gets planted with love and tended with patience." As they walked toward the house, Luke noticed Mrs. Chen waving from her garden, where she was harvesting the first vegetables of the spring season. Harold was helping Pete Morrison repair a section of fence that had been damaged in the winter storms. The Morales children were playing in their backyard, their laughter mixing with the sounds of a neighborhood that had rediscovered its sense of community. That evening, as Luke helped Ellie with her homework at the kitchen table where the diamond had once sat, she looked up from her math worksheet with a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Daddy, are we rich?" Luke paused in his review of her multiplication problems, considering how to answer a question that might have multiple meanings. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Ellie looked around their small kitchen, taking in the evidence of their life together, her artwork on the refrigerator, the herbs growing on the windowsill, the comfortable chaos of a home where people were loved and cared for. "I think we're the right kind of rich," she said finally, "the kind that makes you happy instead of worried." Luke smiled and returned to checking her math, struck once again by his daughter's ability to understand complex ideas with simple clarity. She was right, of course. They were rich in ways that couldn't be measured in bank statements or investment portfolios, rich in community connections, family love, moral clarity, and the deep satisfaction that came from choosing principles over profit when it mattered most. Later that night, Luke sat on his back porch looking out at the garden where their adventure had begun and ended. The spot where the diamond had been buried for 60 years now held tomato plants that would eventually produce fruit, connecting their family to Isabel's memories of her father's garden in France. Luke thought about his grandfather Heinrich, whose careful planning had orchestrated a moment of moral choice across 3 generations. He thought about Samuel Reeves, whose guilt had preserved a treasure until it could be returned to its rightful owner. He thought about Sarah, whose wisdom had guided him toward decisions that honored love over money. And he thought about Isabel, whose grace and dignity had transformed what could have been a legal dispute into a story of international friendship and family connection. The garden that had given them an impossible treasure had ultimately provided something far more valuable, the discovery that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary choices when they trusted their hearts over their fears. Luke and Ellie had planted seeds of integrity in their community, and those seeds were growing into connections and possibilities that would enrich their neighborhood for years to come. As Luke finally headed inside, he paused to look at the moon shining down on their small backyard. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between easy and right, new chances to model for Ellie, the kind of person he wanted her to become. But tonight, he felt the deep peace that comes from knowing that when it mattered most, he had chosen well. The diamond was gone, returned to where it belonged. But the real treasure, the love between father and daughter, the connections that bound community together, the satisfaction of moral courage in action, remained, growing stronger with each season of careful tending. Luke smiled and turned off the porch light, ready for whatever seeds the future might bring.